Yes, we will open the series of very interesting lectures to which we look forward a lot with a talk by Cameron Petrie and Carla Lancelotti from the University of Cambridge and the University of Barcelona. And their topic today is living in the diverse environments of the Indus civilizations, insights from the sky down and ground up. Now, both of them have a long history in the archaeology of the Near East, and particularly the region of Pakistan and India. Carla graduated in archaeology at the University of Bologna in archaeology, and she obtained her PhD in archaeobotany at Cambridge. So she is specialized now in long-term human ecology of drylands, and her work addresses the essential role of the so-called secondary resources for the adaptation and resilience of past and present socio-ecological systems in dryland. And she conducts research in South Asia, Europe, Near East, Africa, and South America from the Neolithic to the historic period. So it's really a very, very long time frame and wide geographic region. And Cameron Petrie is in Cambridge now. He joined the university there in 2005 as a Research Council UK Fellow in South Asian and Iranian archaeology. And he was appointed a lecturer in 2010 and became a reader in 2014 and in 2016. So prior to there, he was in Oxford and completed his PhD at the university in Sydney. So it's a long history, and I'm sure that all of you know him also from his long history in archaeological fieldwork in Pakistan, India, and Iran, where he continues working up to today. And the article of the researchers of both experts speaking today you can find in numerous publications in the internet. And since two of them are speaking now today, I will now hand over the talk and the microphone to Cameron, who is speaking first.
Thank you very much, Uta. Hang on, just make sure I do this correctly. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the screen. So thank you very much to Uta and Prabhakar for inviting me to speak in conjunction with Carla. This is very much a reflection. Carla and I have known each other for a very long time as well. And we've worked together in different archaeological sites and also projects. Partly, this is hopefully not a lecture that's divided into two halves that are very, very different, but it's two halves that are complementary. Partly what we're talking about is our own research that reflects on the research that have been done by a lot of colleagues, either our predecessors or colleagues that are actually working on projects with us. So hopefully we'll do justice in terms of what we explain in terms of previous research, and also give some reflection and new insights on the type of work that we've been doing. So the Indus civilization is very familiar to hopefully everyone, but I think it's useful to be clear that we're talking about an ancient cultural phenomenon that it existed across a very large area of what is now modern Pakistan and Western India. And we have a number of large settlements that are known to have been Indus cities. We also have medium-sized sites and a vast number of small village settlements that are set across a very large landscape. My own research has tried very hard to emphasize the importance of the rural context in the Indus civilization. And it's very clear that there are ways of looking at the Indus civilization that emphasize similarity and uniformity on the one hand, and there are ways that emphasize diversity and variation on the other. So if you look at it at a base level, you could say that the subsistence practices of the Indus populations involve the use of the zebu, water buffalo, sheep and goat, and combinations of winter and summer crops. There's often much said about the things that make the Indus civilization distinctive, and often it's made, attention is drawn to the fact of the uniformity of material culture and similarity of certain aspects, things like the use of seals, the use of the Indus script, the presence of weights and weight systems, the commonality of the use of exotic raw materials to produce elaborate craft products. But although there is this sort of degree of similarity that overlies the Indus civilization populations, there is also regional diversity that exists underneath that. So there's a lot of variation in terms of the pottery that's being produced, the types of figurines, and the on-the-ground practices. So those principles are going to be underpinning some of the things that we're going to be talking about now. We're going to give you a little bit of an overview of research on climate and environment, latest research in those areas, a little bit of insights into the archaeology of settlement. I'll make a very brief comment on the archaeology of the subsistence in the diverse and variable landscapes, very much recognizing that there's going to be a talk next week from Marco Madella and Jennifer Bates covering those topics. And then Carla will be speaking exploring some case study research on ethnography and archaeology of millet cultivation before we finish. So just to go on to talk about climate and environment across the Indus civilization, it's worth pointing out that for actually quite some time, our colleagues have been talking about the realities of environmental and potentially cultural diversity in the Indus civilization, going all the way back to the 1980s. Gregory Purcell was talking about domains, regional units, regional entities, cultural geographic regions. These sort of ideas were also elaborated on by Stephen Weber when he was talking about Harappan agro-ecological zones. And underlying these sorts of ideas was very much the fact that there was a considerable range of similarity in a lot of practices, but also variation that existed underneath those practices. One of the things that I found very, very interesting was when you started to plot the distribution of these domains and zones onto the landscape, you actually saw particular patterns starting to appear. So although they were described as agro-ecological zones, they actually perhaps are a little bit overly simplistic in terms of the way that these areas were demarcated. So you can see on this map, Purcell's domains plotted on top of the different geographical regions that we can identify. Some of them are associated with floodplains. Some of them are associated with more arid areas. And if you look at the eastern region, which I've given an outline in orange dotted lines, you can see this encompasses a vast area, including large parts of Rajasthan, Haryana, Punjab, and even areas of the Ganges, Yamuna, Doab area in northern India. So in a sense, although there's been recognition of the geographical diversity, it's perhaps been oversimplified, and there's probably much more diversity in the environments that ancient Indus populations lived in. And that diversity and also the variation in the climate can be emphasized just by comparing these photographs of different regions within and around the Indus River Basin. So you can see what the agricultural plains are adjacent to the Indus River are like, which are quite different to the areas of the Indus Yamuna, the Sutlej Yamuna interfluve. We have areas of Makran, Baluchistan, and southern Sindh, which are also quite different to the areas immediately adjacent to the Indus River. We also have areas along the borderlands of the Suleiman Range, which are extremely different to the desert areas of Cholistan. Now, I include a photograph at the bottom, which is actually a photograph taken of the archaeological site of Ganweriwala in August last year, immediately after the intensive monsoon rain that fell on Pakistan. What this emphasizes in actual fact is the desert is not always the same as well. So all of these landscapes and environments change and are variable based on weather conditions, temperature, atmospheric conditions, and long-term cycles of change. So the thing that quite a bit of my research has focused on in the last 10 years or so have been the dynamics and the drivers that dictate why there is diversity and variation in weather and climate. Research on the weather systems and attempting to model weather and weather variation has really emphasized that the Indus River Basin is clearly dominated by two different rainfall systems, a summer and a winter rainfall system. But looking at the data that we have available from the modern atmospheric record, which emphasizes that weather and rainfall changes within individual years. The weather patterns are different between years, and then patterns change over decadal, centennial, and even millennial scales. So what we're dealing with in this particular environment is a very variable and diverse climatic zone. And that is actually emphasized by the distribution of modern climate in this region. This is a map that shows the Köppen Geiger climate zones as they are distributed across the northern area of the subcontinent, the northwest. So you can see the light yellow colors are areas that are arid, the lighter brown are semi-arid areas, and the slightly darker brown are temperate areas. And the dots on these maps show the distribution of Indus and Sorath and Kuli archaeological sites. So what's clear is that populations either connected with the Indus civilization or the neighboring regions were occupying different climate zones. Now, one of the things that's been problematic for archaeologists for a long time was really to try and understand the nature of the climate 4 or 5,000 years ago. And up until relatively recently, there was actually almost no paleoclimate evidence from within the areas occupied by Indus populations. This is a map taken from Gregory Purcell's book, published in 2002, which shows the distribution of the paleoclimate records, some of which were coming from archaeological sites, many of which were coming from lake records within different parts of Rajasthan. And it was long recognized, actually going back to a very important paper by Marco Medella and Dorian Fuller, published in 2006, was that these paleoclimate records provide us with useful information, but there are also gaps and problems with the interpretation of that material. So part of the work that was done for the Land Water Settlement Project and follow on for the Two Rains projects, which I've been involved with a range of different collaborators, especially my colleague R.N. Singh from Banaras Hindu University, a number of different students and collaborators at institutions both within India and also in the UK. We've started to collect paleoclimate records from areas immediately adjacent to or even within the bounds of the Indus area of occupation. And what you can see is that these areas are susceptible to winter and summer rain. The winter rain on this one you can see on the left-hand side, summer rain on the right, but we now have a number of new proxies which are able to give us important insights into what's happening in the paleoclimate. Some of our earliest work was focusing on the areas around Haryana in northwestern India, and it became apparent that we could see clear evidence for climate change and variability at different points during the Holocene. So around 8,200 years ago, there was evidence for the monsoon weakening. At around 5,000 years ago, so around 3000 BC, the beginning of the Kotdiji period in Indus parlance, there was evidence for the intensification of the monsoon. And then at around 4,200 years ago, 2200 BC, evidence for monsoon weakening again. So these different records emphasize quite a degree of climate fluctuation in the Indus region. But what these records have not been able to tell us is what seasons those climate patterns were fluctuating. So relatively recent research that was using a climate core by Staubwasser, which was published in 2003, and it was reanalyzed by a PhD student based here in Cambridge, Alina Giescher, was able to reveal changes in the winter and changes in the summer rainfall patterns. These are analysis results using stable isotope analysis on foraminifera, which have been collected off the coast where the Indus River flows out into the Arabian Sea. And what you can see on the graph at the top is the curve that shows the intensity variation in winter rainfall. And it emphasizes that there's actually a peak in winter rainfall up until around 4,400 BP 2400 BC, and then a decline down until the period of the so-called 4.2 Ka climate event. So it looks like there is an increase in the level of winter rain and then a decline. Interestingly, that pattern is actually quite different to what's evident for the summer rain, which is shown on the lower curve, where the summer rain appears to have reached a peak around 5000 BP, so 3000 BC, and then actually had declined throughout the 3rd millennium BC. And then the winter and summer rain both became weak at around 4200 BP. So these are paleoclimate records that have been extremely well dated, and this particular record was published in 2019. So what's interesting about these records is that even within the critical period that the Indus civilization existed, the winter and summer rain are not falling at the same rate. And they both seem to suffer from a deterioration around 4200 BC. This is information that's coming from water flowing through the Indus system and ending up in the Arabian Sea. What I can now happily present to you is the results of a piece of research that was started quite some time ago and has been in review for about 2 years. And it was published by a little bit of surprise last week, which is the speleothem published, a speleothem collected from a cave in northern India called Dharamjali. This was also published, lead author is Alina Gisha, who's the former student from here, but in collaboration with colleagues in India and also colleagues from universities in the UK. Now, this is a speleothem that was collected from a cave about 15 meters underground. And the analysis of this speleothem has actually been quite revolutionary in terms of using multiple methods of analysis: uranium, thorium, X-ray diffraction, oxygen and carbon isotopes, and different types of mass spectrometry analysis have looked at the growth rings of this stalagmite that is developed in this cave and identified the nature of the climate in this particular region from the period of 4.2 thousand years ago onwards. Now, what this climate record shows is actually something that's it's extremely important because it enables us to differentiate between patterns of winter and summer rain, but it also identifies that this period was not dominated by one extended period of drought, but there were phases of aridification that lasted in the first instance for 30 years, in the second instance for 60 years, and then the third instance for 90 years. So this period of 200 years was dominated by a series of 3 different extreme aridity events. Now, this is extremely important for trying to understand impact upon the Indus civilization and the potential impact upon urbanism and other sorts of dynamics. Now, working from that underpinning, that paleoclimate record, we can say that the paleoclimate of the Holocene is variable and that climate was a factor that the populations of the Indus civilization really had to wrestle with and contend with and adapt to. So in thinking about those dynamics, I'm going to talk hopefully briefly about the settlement and evidence that we have for living in diverse and variable landscapes. And this again wavers between talking about research that's been done by scholars over the last 100 years or so, even research that's been published extremely recently by other colleagues, and research that we're currently engaged in ourselves. Now, it's important to mention that when talking about the Indus River Basin, we're aware that we have this well-known river that dominates the name and the naming system. We also have the rivers of Punjab. And we know that the Indus region also has a long-running debate about the existence of a paleo river that is now no longer visible, no longer carries water, but that has no doubt been very, very significant in the past and is important in terms of trying to understand the nature of settlement and dynamics in the Indus civilization. Now, over the last 10 years or so, there's been some targeted attempts to understand the dates that river water flowed through this hydrological system. And there were two separate projects, one running in Pakistan and one in India. And this is research that's been published by other scholars. But the important thing to say is that there's actually no fixed consensus on what happens with the hydrology of the Gagha-Hakra system. And this is often connected to the Sarasvati that's known from different texts and literature. But we are left in a situation where we lack consensus in terms of the interpretation of this part of the hydrological system, and also, in actual fact, the nature of the hydrological dynamics of the Greater Punjab. So what we started to do as part of the Two Rains project, and it's continued under a number of subsequent projects that are still running, is really to try and use multiple different methods and to combine maps, to combine machine learning, and to combine multispectral imagery to try and understand what's going on with regard to the Gagha-Hakra river system itself, and how that then intersects with the rivers of Greater Punjab. In addition to that, we're also interested in trying to really understand the settlement systems in these areas. So we've started to do project work in northern India, in the area of Haryana and Punjab, which we've been working on reconstructing the hydrology and the settlement landscapes of those areas. And more recently, we've expanded to work to reassess the archaeological site distribution and landscapes of Cholistan. And we've also started to move further north into Punjab to try and use the same methods to try and work out what it is that we can actually see. Now, within northern India, we've combined a number of innovative approaches to landscape and hydrological reconstruction in an attempt to try and reconstruct the complex hydrology of the plains of Haryana and Punjab. And using these methods, using vegetation indices, using high-resolution topographic digital elevation models, it's become clear that there is evidently a large paleochannel that existed across this landscape, but there are actually many, many other paleochannels that are similarly important and probably carrying water during the period in which this area was occupied by Indus populations. So what's clear from this, hopefully, is that it's become very obvious that the landscape is much more complicated than we've probably been recognizing as archaeologists. And what's essential is that we try and match up the landscape reconstruction with the archaeological settlement distribution information. So moving away from the Yamuna and Sutlej Doab, interfluve of northern India, we've started to do work looking at the landscapes of Cholistan and looking at remote sensing information and reassessing legacy data that's been published by other scholars. Most importantly, Professor Rafiq Mughal's groundbreaking surveys that were conducted in the 1970s and expanded in the 1990s that really looked at the distribution of archaeological sites of this very, very important area. Now, using statistical analysis, we were able to demonstrate that many of these sites appear to be only occupied in individual periods, and there's very little continuity of occupation between chronological periods. So this actually suggests that this particular part of the landscape was characterized by very regular displacement of populations. Now, we know that that's very likely to have been influenced by a combination of rainfall and water flow, but we haven't yet been able to reconstruct the nature of those dynamics. What we have been able to do is to use satellite remote sensing and different multispectral image bands to try and work out ways of identifying what archaeological sites look like in a satellite image, and then using a computer and machine learning to identify these features on the ground. So this is not an image that shows the stars in the night sky, but it's actually a desert landscape with archaeological sites that are highlighted as bright lights in this image. So looking at this sort of method of identifying sites trying to match those up with what Professor Mughal found when he was surveying on the ground, it's then been possible to reconstruct the types of landscapes that we're actually finding these sites in, which is actually quite an important discovery. So most of the sites that have been documented already exist in the areas that are between the agricultural land and the sand dunes. So these areas of dahar, these hardened land surfaces that have not yet been occupied by modern farmers and have not been consumed by the expanding sand dunes. So what we see is actually probably only a glimpse of actually what was there originally. And I think that reality also is true when we look at other areas. Now, I realize I'm going to just highlight some of the work that we've started to do in areas further to the north. This is an area that was, again, surveyed by Professor Rafiq Mughal and his team as part of the Department of Archaeology and Museums of Punjab archaeological documentation. It was subsequently investigated by Professor Rita Wright in the lead of the Beas Archaeological Survey. And I've shown an image here on the top left-hand side. And what you can see here is an area of Punjab where we have archaeological sites that are distributed in relationship to the known courses of modern rivers. Now, in a really important paper that was published, I think, only 1 month ago by Jessica Sana and Rita Wright, has hypothesized the existence of a canal system that connects a number of Indus Civilization sites that sit out in the area between the relic Beas River and the Sutlej River that we know are cutting across the modern landscape. Independent of that discovery, we've been doing work to reconstruct the complex hydrology of this part of Punjab to see how different it is to what we're seeing in Haryana and northwest India. Now, what we've been able to do is to combine these multiple methods of approaches using the remote sensing imagery, using the digital elevation models, and also making use of Rafiq Mughal's archaeological site database. And therefore, this is work being done by Arnau Garcia, who's a colleague who was based here for a short time in Cambridge, who's now based in ICAC in Tarragona in Spain. Now, what Arnau has managed to do is to plot the location of archaeological sites on top of the reconstructed landscapes of this part of Punjab. And this is, I mentioned briefly here, this is an area that had also been worked on as part of a PhD thesis by Smith that was submitted in 2007. And what that research actually showed, and what our recent research also shows, is that this particular part of Punjab is actually different to Cholistan. It's also quite different to the areas of northwestern India. So in this area, you can see the lowest of the rivers here that's marked in heavy lines in blue is the modern course of the Sutlej. And on either side of the Sutlej, you can see the edges of the floodplain and the bluff lines that demarcate the limitations of that river. And what you can actually see is that the Sutlej plain, as we currently know, is actually completely devoid of Indus archaeological sites. That's quite different to the situation you can see on the Beas River, which runs down the center of the image, or at least the Paleo-Beas, which is the area that was surveyed by Professor Wright and her team. And you can see along the Paleo-Beas, there's actually clusters of archaeological sites. But then we know actually relatively recently, the Beas has subsequently shifted its course and it joins together in the Sutlej much further to the north. You can also see on this image the course of the Ravi River that flows past Harappa and also quite close to other sites like Tulamba before it flows into the other rivers of the Punjab. What this image highlights is that these rivers that we can now see that have quite fixed channels were very active and mobile in the past, and they've cut widely across the landscape and reshaped the landscape intensively. Now, in relationship to the recently identified the potential canal in the area of Punjab, which you can see highlighted in the box in orange on the map at the top here. This is, Kasana and Wright have suggested that there's evidence for a canal, and this presumably connected to either the Beas or the Sutlej. What's interesting in terms of the work that we've conducted is that in actual fact, these sites are probably sitting on the bluff line of the Sutlej River. So we don't know exactly where the Sutlej was in the past, but it may well have been extremely close to these sites. So this actually adds a slightly interesting nuance to the interpretation that's been recently published by Kasana and Wright. And if you look at the image on the right, you can see the 4 red dots of the sites, and you can see below that image traces of very, very sinuous river systems. So this is a very, very active alluvial area. Now, the reason that I'm going into this level of detail is because that these dynamics of the landscape and the movement of rivers and the shifting of rivers over time have a very dramatic impact upon what we can say about where archaeological sites are located and what the patterns that we see actually tell us. And I think for me, this has been one of the most revealing discoveries of the Two Rains project, is that what we see is not what we think it is, if that makes sense. So as part of the Two Rains project work, we started to work systematically to document archaeological sites and to map them across large areas of the landscape. And we recognized that historical maps that were initially compiled by the Survey of India during the British period, and which go on to be produced by the surveys of India and the Survey of Pakistan. These maps incidentally actually documented hundreds, if not thousands, of archaeological sites. So a new project which has been running for now about 2 years, the Mapping Archaeological Heritage in South Asia project, has been starting to look at all of the available maps that we can get hold of. The maps shown on the right in dark green are the maps that cover most of the Indus River Basin that we've actually got coverage of. And you can see we've now have over 1,000 of these maps georeferenced. And by using a different version of machine learning, it's been possible to identify some of these features systematically. Maps that have form lines or hatches. And this is a piece of research which is similarly in press. It's been submitted, but using a trained algorithm to identify features on these maps, it's been possible to find almost 6,000 potential archaeological sites distributed across predominantly the northern areas of Punjab and the areas of northwestern India. This is information that is extremely rich. The prospect of actually having found 6,000 archaeological sites, many of which maybe haven't been documented before, is extremely challenging, because in the end, all we're doing at the moment is identifying features using a computer. What we really need to do is to go on the ground and conduct detailed surface surveys. And we have been doing this in conjunction with the work that we've been doing thus far. And it is possible to document periods within which sites were occupied, to get some really nuanced information about site threat and damage to heritage as well. But rather than talk about that, which is a very different topic, I will just make some comments about the sorts of sites that we've been looking at in northwestern India. So we've done some detailed landscape analysis in the areas around Rakhigarhi, and sorry, I'm just being bombed by various people. So the area around Rakhigarhi has a number of very, very important archaeological sites, including the sites of Lohari Rago, Masudpur 1 and Masudpur 7, which have been excavated by our collaborative projects. Now, what's interesting about these archaeological sites is that they show evidence for occupation of a landscape that today looks extremely flat. But by looking at the sort of methods that we've been using, it is possible to see that the landscape is not boring or flat whatsoever, but it is actually characterized by sinuous rivers that are probably ephemeral rather than perennial. And they show a close association with many of these archaeological sites. Now, what we've been able to see is also something that today looks like this, which is a very flat archaeological mound, but in actual fact, by drilling cores down into the ground around these archaeological sites, it's been possible to reconstruct the subsurface archaeology around these particular areas and to suggest that archaeological sites are actually situated in close proximity to rivers and small paleochannels. They sometimes have association with ponds, sometimes they're associated with flood areas, and most of these settlement locations are associated with the important subsistence strategies that were being carried out by the ancient inhabitants. Now, I'm conscious that I'm chewing up time, and I'm going to just quickly shift to talk very briefly about subsistence in the diverse and variable landscapes of the Indus civilization. And then I'm going to hand over to Carla to bring us home with a whole new set of information that's coming from her work. Now, in keeping with what we know about the Indus civilization and the research that's been done by a wide range of researchers prior to me, there's been a progressive increase in our knowledge of the plants and crops that have been exploited by Indus populations. And we now have a very large compilation of different crops that are known to have been a part of the crop assemblages used by Indus populations. And they include both summer and winter crops. So it's quite clear that Indus farmers were capable of growing crops in 2 seasons. What's clear, however, is also it's unlikely that every single Indus farmer was growing every single Indus crop in both seasons. And working in collaboration with Jennifer Bates, a collaborator of mine, who is going to be speaking next week, we've come up with some hypotheses about the differences between winter rain and summer rain in the Indus civilization, and possibly differences in the types of subsistence practices that were being engaged in by populations living in different areas. So looking largely on the basis of rainfall distribution, it's likely that some farmers were engaging in summer-dominated agricultural growing systems. Some perhaps were engaging in winter-dominated agricultural systems. Some where both winter and summer cropping were possible, but winter was probably dominant. And other areas, perhaps northwestern India and also the area up in the very northern part of Punjab, where farming and cropping was extremely flexible in terms of adaptation to the landscape. So I'm going to hand over to Carla now, and she, in theory, is going to take over. So I'll just unshare my screen, make sure this works. Okay.
Yeah. We'll try our best to do this without problems. Okay, I think it worked. Well,
yep.
Not really, because it's the wrong slide, but yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Cameron. And I want to extend my thanks to Ute and Prabhakar for inviting me to give this presentation. Cameron has given a very good and wide introduction on the climate and the environment, and the settlement pattern and where people were settling, and the fact that the vast expanse of the Indus civilization had occupied different ecological zones and niches. And he's introduced briefly the topic of subsistence strategies, which again, as we said, we're not going too much into that because it will probably be the focus of next week's presentation by Jennifer and Marco. What I wanted to tell you, or what I wanted to show you right now, is the part that's more going like on the ground, and I want to concentrate specifically on summer crops. Why summer crops? Well, because again, as Cameron has said, there was this idea that the Indus Valley civilization was sort of uniform in its characteristic and in its subsistence patterns as well. And everyone knows that the big sites like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro are based on what we know so far is that the winter crops are prevalent and they've been identified in the archaeological record and the archaeobotanical record by many people before me. Whereas, we know a little bit less on the summer crops, and especially what we know so far is that they seem to increase, or the use of summer crops seems to increase with time. So, and sometimes it has been said that this is because of the progressive aridification, and it has been linked somehow to the collapse of the Indus civilization, and hopefully I'm going to show you that it's probably not the case. So just as a quick introduction, I'm going to talk today mostly about millets. So for those of you who are not very familiar with millets, with this term, we actually include a wide varieties of species and genera. And they're all small-seeded annual grasses, which has been considered for a long time as grain crops that were cultivated primarily on marginal lands in dry areas and of temperate, tropical, and subtropical regions. What does that mean? It means that mostly millets have been considered as secondary crops, as crops that were either cultivated in lands that could not sustain wheat or barley or rice agriculture, or that were cultivated in times of water scarcity and sort of climatic crisis. What we know so far about millets is that, as I said, they are a very diverse group of plants, so they've been domesticated all over the world. The main three groups are the American millets, which I'm not going to consider today, the African millet, and the South Asian or the Asian millets. And what we know so far is that during the Indus Valley Civilization in the archaeobotanical record, we find both local, so both Asian millets and African millets. Okay. But how much do we find of these crops? Well, not many. According to a database of archaeobotanical findings that was compiled by Jennifer Bates and up to data published up till 2017, of all the Indus sites that have been studied archaeobotanically, which are about 63 that are included in the dataset, millets have been found at 29 sites, so about half, less than half. And there's 38 entries for millet in the whole database. I mean, 38 different single entries for millets. And in this graph, you can see a little bit how they are distributed. You can see that they found both in the early Harappan, mature Harappan, and late Harappan periods. They are a bit more frequent in the mature Harappan, but that might also reflect the fact that these are the sites or the phases that have the better archaeobotanical investigation. And what is interesting to highlight is that you have, or we found African millet as well in all the three periods, so not just in the mature and the late periods. So my research concentrates particularly on African millet and on these three species: sorghum, eleusine, which is finger millet, and penicetum, which is pearl millet. And these particular three species have been found in 15 of the 29 sites that have millets in general. So again, about half the sites that had millets presents remains of these African species. And again, as I was saying before, they are present in each period. okay, of the in which we divide the material up. And this is just to show over the entire extension of the Indus Valley civilization and over the entire number of sites that we have investigated so far. This is where millets have been found. Not only African millets, but all type of millets. But what I want to highlight here is these three sites: Banawali, Rohira in the north, and Babarkot in the south, or Gujarat, where we have identification of African species in the early Harappan period. Now, these are not directly dated, and there might have been some problems. I mean, identifying millets in the macrobotanical record is not that easy, so there might be misidentification, but the fact is that according to the published records, we have early evidence of African millets, not only in Gujarat, which could be sort of, you know, understandable if they arrive from Africa. You know, the first port of entry, let's say it's the coast, so it's the south. But we do have them also in the north, which means that they've traveled quite a long way. As I was saying, identifying millet in the archaeobotanical record is not that easy. In fact, many people consider them some sort of missing crops. And this is because millet grains are much smaller than other cereals, than wheat and barley or rice, for example. And the fact that they might be underrepresented in the archaeobotanical record has long been recognized, especially from work done in Africa, where these are staple crops. So specifically, like two works, one quite old in 1999, already stated that, you know, the fact that finger millet is underrepresented in the archaeological record might be linked to a variety of different reasons, because of diet, because of taxonomy, because, you know, plant processing activities, which are usually what constitute, you know, what form the archaeobotanical record might not be happening at site, so you don't see this. But also they identified possible physical and biological degradation, so post-depositional effects, as a problem for the conservation of finger millets. And more recent work, you know, experimental work, said that, or evidence that at temperature above 220 degrees, millets are almost completely destroyed. So we have here another possible explanation for why we don't find millets in the charred macrobotanical remains. However, more recent work highlighted the fact that actually there has been a contradiction between the possible presence and the actual presence of millet in the archaeobotanical record, because sometimes you have indirect evidences, like, for example, stable isotopes results on human and animals that indicates a presence in the diet of C4 plants, which are, you know, basically millet in our area of the world. There might be textual information that, you know, points to the presence and use of millet whenever it has textual information, but then we don't find it in the archaeological record. And you know, the poor macrobotanical preservation might be a reason to it, but we do have now different tools to look at this crop, which is basically micro remains. And this is just a list of studies that we've been conducted with my research group on micro remains of phytolith starch from different sites in drylands. And actually, whenever you look at micro remains, you find traces of C4 plants, of millets. And today I'm just going to briefly show the South Asian cases, because it's, you know, what we're here for. This is the work, the PhD work of Carolina Jimenez, who is about to finish. So hopefully this will become published very soon. During her PhD, she has studied starch and phytoliths from sediments, but also from grinding stones and pottery from 2 sites in Sindh, Pakistan, that we are excavating now with Marco Madella. And again, she finds evidence of C4 of millets in all her samples. And actually, when we look at her results from the point of view of the comparison between macrobotanical and microbotanical results, so if you see the 2 pies at the bottom, the blue ones, so you have grain crops that compose more or less 90% of the archaeobotanical assemblage, both in the early and the mature phases, and out of which you have in the early phases 41% are C4, are millets, and 59 are big cereal. This proportion reduces it a little bit during the mature wrap. And basically what these graphs are saying is that actually at these sites, people were using more millets in the early phases than in the later phases. So the fact, you know, it kind of goes against the what we knew so far. But also the starch, if you see, the starch is basically mostly from C4, which are the Panicoideae, right? So no, I mean, in the early phases are most of them. In the later, they decrease a little bit, but they still compose almost 30% of the archaeobotanical record. So this is just to say that when you look for millet, you find millets, but you have to look for them. So how do we know whether it's, or how could we know whether it's worth going the extra step and looking at the microbotanical remains? Well, I mean, I'm a phytolith person, so I would say it's always worth looking, but I understand that that might not be possible all the time. So the next step of the work that we've been trying to do was to try and model the presence and use of these crops in the area of study. So crop simulation models have been done for many years, not only in physiology, like in plant physiology or agronomy, but also in archaeology. For example, on this slide, you can see a model that is actually part of Cameron's project done by Andrea Sangourakis, who looked at various characteristic of soil and weather and crops, and tried to model the land use in the Indus Valley. And he was able also to model crop yield. So the bottom violin chart, you see per millet, which is the second point, has a the first violin type, proso millet, again FC4, and per millet have quite a high yield compared to also wheat and barley. Okay, so proso millet has the highest yield possible, and per millet has a comparable yield with wheat and barley. And these models are normally based on the characteristic of the crops. So what are the requirements for the crops to grow? Because that's quite easy, you know. Plants need a certain amount of water, of nutrients, of soil, of light, etc. to grow. So once you know what are the plant requirements, you can model them, you can input that into your model and do your interpretations. But when we look at millets, there's actually not that big of a consensus of what are the requirements for millets. And, you know, if you see here, you go from, temperature or water quantity that goes from 200 millimeters to 1000 millimeters. But you also find, other sources say that no, actually 300 millimeter or 250 millimeters, they're enough. So it's kind of a very varied type of information. Plus, all this doesn't really take into account the people's choice, right? We know that people do tend to grow things that they like, and obviously, if the environmental conditions are not adequate, they need to put in place some sort of technical strategy like irrigation or something like this. But people do put in place these strategies in order to grow what they like to eat, right? So what we did was we took a slightly different approaches. So we looked at a cross-cultural information on all the communities worldwide who actually today cultivate the millet, these three species of millet that we are interested in, which are pear millet, sorghum, and finger millet. And we basically mapped it worldwide. And then we extracted information, like from databases. We extracted environmental variables and climatic variables of the areas where these crops are grown. And we try to see what was the main variable that influenced the growth of these, or the cultivation of these crops in these areas. And then, sorry, we compared, go back a little, we compared the results of our modeling with the ethnographical interviews that we conducted in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Pakistan, to see whether our models were predicting, in a certain sense, what was going on concretely on the ground. And actually, one of the main results is that water, or the quantity of water, which is normally measured in terms of annual rainfall, is never an important variable for cultivating these crops. So the important variables are mostly related with soil condition, and with not how much it rains, but when it rains, comparing to the growth cycle of the plant. And this is a constant, and it's across all world, across all the communities that we have looked at. And you might think now, okay, obviously, I mean, because you've looked at such a wide expansion of geographical expansion, that might be linked to where the people are, but this is actually not the case, because the geographical location, so the coordinate, let's say, it's never significant in predicting what's going on, right? So this is really something that it's environmental. And as I was saying, we tested the model with the ethnographic interview, and it actually, the capacity of the model to predict what we found with the interviews was actually very high, between 60 and 80%, which, for those of you who know modeling, this is quite a high score. So what we did was to look at the characteristics, at the soil and environmental characteristic of the area that we are interested in, so the Indus Valley, and map and use our model and run our model to map the possible areas where these crops might have been cultivated in the past. And this is basically resume the concentrated image for sorghum. So the shaded area, let's say, it's all areas where sorghum might have been cultivated or might be cultivated according to the variables that showed up as important in our model. But we went a little bit further, because one of the things that we were looking at in our database search was also how these crops were cultivated. So whether they were irrigated or they were rain-fed. And as you can see, the green, so the only irrigated the only area where sorghum could grow irrigated is the green one. So it's basically the Thar Desert. Everywhere else, you could grow sorghum just rainfed, right? But this is still, again, a model, right? So we thought, how can we try and understand whether, you know, this is something that actually went on in you know, in the past. So we took a phytolith database that I had produced during my PhD on these 4 sites, Harappa, Lamgirpur, Shikarpur, and Kammer, all urban phase, so mature Harappan, let's say, samples. And as you can see, these sites are located in slightly different environmental zone in terms of, you know, type of environment. So Harappa, it's about 371 millimeter average precipitation. Alamgirpur is a little bit more. Shikarpur and Kammer are about the same as Alamgirpur, but you know, Harappa is located on, you know, the Indus, well, in an alluvial plain. Alamgirpur as well. Shikarpur and Kammer are in a quite arid part of Gujarat. So what we did was looking at this collection of samples. We cleaned the data sets that were produced to select only C4 phytolith morphotypes. And then we applied a model that we developed with experimental growth of crops. And I'm not going to bother you with that because that's another talk. So we did grow crops experimentally with different water availability, and then we extracted phytoliths, we looked at them, we quantified, we quantified and classified. So, and then we took the assemblages and we modeled what were the specific morphotypes that were related more to water availability. And so we applied that model to the archaeological model, and basically, to make a long story short, this graph is basically showing you the probability that the phytoliths produced by these plants were coming from plants that were well watered, well irrigated, right? And you can see all the samples are below 50%, which indicates that probably these plants or these phytoliths come from plants that they were growing in more or less water scarcity condition, right? And this, if you remember, so these are summer crops. Again, these are millet grown through the summer. And if you remember what Cameron said a little bit a while ago, that the decline and the decline in summer rains during the Indus Civilization, well, this is actually pretty consistent with his data. And so to go back to the map, the blue diamond are the sites that I'm talking about. And as you can see, according to the model, they all fall into an area of intensive rain-fed cultivation. So again, plants that are cultivated just with the rain that's available to them, so non-irrigated. And it seems like everything nicely fits together, which it's really a surprising result for me. So I think this is all for my part, because you know, I think we are also over time. As I don't know if Cameron, if you want to take over the conclusions.
Yeah, I'll try and be very, very brief.
Yeah.
So I think one thing to just say, I think both the things that I've talked about and the things that Carla talked about have actually unintentionally fit very nicely together. Not intentionally in the sense that we haven't talked about it, we know, but we're not aiming to fit together. It's just, I think the data that we're obtaining is actually pushing us in an interesting direction. And I think it's very clear that we have the Indus River Basin and its surrounding areas are impacted by winter and summer rain. And those two rainfall systems are quite variable in themselves. So there's a term that you could say that they're predictable in the sense that both rain systems will deliver water, but the amount of water and where it falls will be unpredictable. And there's a lot of variability across this landscape, and that has an impact upon the landscape itself, and also the choices that people made in terms of the crops that they grow and how they grow those crops. So one of the things that, next slide, Carla, one of the things that we hypothesized is that probably, or potentially what happened during the urban period of the Indus civilization was that there was an increase in the unpredictability in terms of the water provision. So the paleoclimate evidence that I showed suggests that there's a decrease in the amount of winter rain, which impacts both direct rainfall on the plains and also the formation of glaciers in the mountains, which then melt in the summer and produce summer water flow. And there's also unpredictability in the summer rainfall as well. And I think when you have that combination of unpredictability, things become quite challenging, and farmers inevitably are dealing with an increase in levels of aridity, and I should say, and they needed to make adaptive choices. One of the suggestions is this argument that populations displaced towards the east, and that is borne out by the existing survey data. But in actual fact, I think some of these arguments may be challenged going forward in the future when we actually get more information about the more complete distribution of archaeological sites. So in many ways, I think we've made lots of interesting progress, but of course there's lots more to do. And I think that's really the best place to end, perhaps. The last slide is just really a list of the fact that, you know, Carla is actually listed on this slide in actual fact, because she and I have been working together for a very long time, and some of her PhD research is involved with this work. And all of this sort of data that we're presenting to you is only possible through a lot of collaboration and a lot of participation from different people, and also lots of funding from different funding agencies as well. And I think I'd just like to thank everybody for the attention that you've given us, and thank everyone that's participated in making what are really a series of really great projects. And I'm sure Carla will add something to that too. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I agree 100%. I mean, this is huge work, and it cannot be done by a few people. It's a real collaboration between people and projects, which, you know, and especially for my part, so the ethnographic part, I'm obviously deeply indebted to the local people, the local farmers who actually, you know, shared their knowledge with us, which was invaluable. So yeah, and thank you very much again for inviting us, and for everyone who's been listening very patiently to this very long talk. Thank you. Thank you.